This Sunday is Trinity Sunday. It is also Memorial Day weekend, as Jason reminded us of its origins. And on this weekend, we remember those who gave their lives in armed conflict, in combat. And so, while on the one hand, we think of the war dead and their sacrifices, we also have to remember that um, that death was tragic, that it is a consequence of human sin. We wish it weren't so. We wish we didn't have to have, or we wish we didn't have a Memorial Day on which to remember those who were killed, often quite young. And so the word that I bring today is a counterpoint about the peace that God envisions for the world that we are not yet living, but nevertheless we keep in front of us. That there is the possibility of a world without war, which seems impossible to us, but with God all things are possible. And so to introduce my reflections on the text, I'm pulling something out of the vault. Uh, for Candlelight 2012, we asked a bunch of people at church one Sunday, what are you afraid of? Some of you may remember this video. Some of you may remember being asked this and your answers being videotaped. Some of you have forgotten, perhaps. But let me play this brief video of Presby folks answering the question, what are you afraid of? And so let's start that. And I hope it's smooth enough and clear enough that you can see their answers.
I am afraid of not knowing what's going to happen in the future.
I'm afraid of the dark. I'm afraid of spiders.
Afraid of spiders.
Spiders? Spiders.
Fears.
Spiders or arachnids in general.
Snakes.
No.
What are you afraid of?
Everything. Everything.
What?
I am afraid of everything.
One single thing.
Snakes and spiders.
All right.
Sometimes I'm afraid of heights.
Yeah.
Heights. I'm afraid of heights.
I'm afraid of heights.
Afraid of.
Heights.
Okay.
I'm afraid of heights and clowns.
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 I'm afraid of flying objects.
Birds. What are you afraid of? Nothing. You aren't afraid of anything? Is there anything you're afraid of?
Something I can't think of right now.
Can't think of anything?
Bees.
That's many
I'm
things.
afraid of moths.
Ants.
Santa Claus.
Santa. Notes. Gerbils.
We are trypophobic.
People dressed as animals.
Mannequins are kind of scary. I am afraid of fear. Myself.
People standing too close to me.
Flying. Failure.
I fear missing God's call. I am afraid that I won't accomplish everything that I want to accomplish.
I fear not making a difference.
Different parts.
Boy, to be able to stand close to other people again in the church building. Something to look forward to. Well, yeah, 8 years ago or so, the answers ran the gamut of common sources of fear, like the dark, heights, certain kinds of animals, snakes, spiders, flying animals, and then fear of failure, and I think underlying, some of those fears, which no one named, but fear of death, fear of the process of dying and of death. Today is the last sermon in our Resurrection Life series. And so, in part, this sermon seeks to explore the question of what is the place and purpose of fear in a life that believes in the resurrection, in the hope of life beyond this world. And so I think our passage today addresses that. So I want to walk us through that briefly and see what we can learn. So, to give the briefest of contexts, Micah, the prophet, the book that we are taking our passage from, Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, Micah is one of the first group of prophets who appeared, who had their speeches, their preaching written down. So, along with Micah, there's Amos, there's Hosea, and there's Isaiah. These are the 8th century prophets. Prior, there were other prophetic figures like Elijah and Elisha, but their sayings and their oracles were not collected into a book of Elijah or a book of Elisha. They're scattered throughout the narratives of books like Samuel and Kings. And this is a prophetic vision, these 4 verses that Amira read for us, and they are not unlike the one that we visualized last Sunday from Ezekiel chapter 37, that vision, that famous vision of the valley of dry bones. And our passage today is also like Ezekiel's, a positive vision, but it comes from a couple centuries earlier. So that opening phrase, in days to come, tells us that this is a vision, a hope that is set in the future. The time is coming. The days are coming when the content of his vision will be realized. And the first phrase I want to draw your attention to is in that next line, the Lord's house, or the house of the Lord. And this refers to the first temple, the one that Solomon built with the help of the Phoenician king Hiram in the middle of the 10th century. So Solomon, you recall, was the 3rd king of all Israel, all 12 tribes. It was Saul and then David, and then David's son Solomon. And the construction of this temple during Solomon's reign is described in 1 Kings 5 through 9 and 2 Chronicles 2 through 7. And just briefly, here is kind of a schematic plan of what this first temple looked like. It has certain regular proportions and dimensions, and contains all of the apparatus that the people of Israel needed to properly worship God. So here's a computerized 3D model of what this first temple looked like before it was destroyed nearly 400 some years later by the Babylonians in Jerusalem. So you see the altar outside and the brazen sea that contained liquid, and inside were the inner sanctum where there was the tablets of the covenant and the cherubim above which was enthroned invisibly the God of Israel. So that's the house of the Lord that Micah is talking about here in this first verse. And then the whole phrase is the mountain of the Lord's house. And this simply refers to the hill on which that first temple was built in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a series of hills. There's one called the City of David, and then there's one that is what we would call the Temple Mount, right? The mountain of the Lord's house. And Micah's vision recognizes that this hill, which is not in absolute terms very high, a very towering presence, there are much taller mountains in ancient Israel, Palestine, has a double meaning. That, like Isaiah, Micah had a vision that this hill on which the temple was built, in God's eyes, was the greatest mountain in the world, Mount Zion. You know, this is Everest you see in the background. And Micah says that this Temple Mount will be established as the highest of the mountains and be raised up above the hills, testifying to its importance in God's eyes, that on this place on earth, in Jerusalem, on this hill, at this place, God's presence was visually and symbolically present with God's people. So it's looking into the future when such a thing would happen, which has not happened yet. At the end of verse 1 and continuing on, we are told, and in what follows on this screen are a series of beautiful parallels, much like the way Craig asked the children to compare. If we look at each of these, we will see an overlapping of ideas, the same idea being echoed and expressed in different ways, which again makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. So notice in this first couplet, peoples shall stream to it, that is the Temple Mount, and many nations shall come. So peoples and many nations are the same, right? They're referring to the same groups. And both are said to come steadily to the Temple Mount. And they are quoted as saying, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob." Okay, again, can you hear that synonymous sort of parallel between the mountain of the Lord, where the house of the God of Jacob, the Lord is the God of Jacob. And so the peoples come from far and wide to go up this hill top to approach the presence of God on earth. Um, yeah, they want to go, they want to come to the place where God is available and accessible. And the purpose to assemble, to gather, again, another parallelism is so that the Lord may teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. God here is a teacher. God is a guide, showing us ways to go, ways to walk in our lives. And we are the students, we are the disciples, we are the walkers who seek this reliable path that the psalmist tells us about. Right? The way of the righteous is watched over by the Lord, but the way of the wicked perishes. Psalm 1. So peoples will come believing that they will find the way of life here in the presence of God. And the last couplet says, "For out of Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." So Micah again spells out that equivalence of Mount Zion and the city of Jerusalem. It's the same place in the prophet's eyes, in the prophet's imagination. And from this place, from this hill, from this Temple Mount, will go forth Torah, that's instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So God's instruction, God's law is identified with the spoken, the divine word. And everyone will come to this place to learn divine wisdom, to study instruction, to study law, to know how one should order one's own life and the life of the community of which they are part, the people of Israel, the church. So, to summarize this section, worldwide people will come to the presence of God on the Temple Mount to gain life. And then there's an interesting image in the following section. It says, now God is portrayed not as a teacher, but as a judge, an arbitrator. That is, somebody who adjudicates a dispute between peoples and between nations. He shall judge between many peoples and shall arbitrate between strong nations far away. And this makes sense in light of the instruction or the law or the word that we saw proceeding from the house of God in the previous verse. Right? God can judge rightly and arbitrate correctly and with impartially because God is the source of justice. The consequence of this judging and arbitrating is probably the most surprising thing in this text. As a result of the arbitration, we are told that they, the peoples, the nations, will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Okay, so I think the swords and spears are easier for us to grasp. We know what they are intuitively. They are weapons of war, of hand-to-hand combat. They are instruments of violence, swords and spears. Plowshares and pruning hooks are probably a little bit less familiar to us unless you're a gardener. Um, but they are the tools that farmers then and now used to prepare the ground and to take care of their crops. So on the one hand, you have instruments of war, and on the other hand, you have instruments of agriculture, of gardening, the tools that bring life out of the ground as opposed to spilling blood. And so that's the transformation that happens in response to divine adjudication, is that nations no longer need to go to war and instead can concentrate on production. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And on a Memorial Day weekend, this seems like a pipe dream. When is it ever going to happen that nations will stop taking up the sword or the gun or the bomb against each other? When will people stop studying war? When will conflict and war become obsolete? We'll say a little more about that in a few minutes. The conclusion of our passage today tells us that, and once they have done these things, beating their swords and spears into plowshares and pruning hooks, they will sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees. And this to me is a picture of prosperity, of stability, of peace. They have what they need. They have the nourishment, the sustenance. Everyone has enough. It seems utopian, right? That everyone has what they need. And the concluding line, and no one shall make them afraid, is to me the most powerful piece of good news in this passage. And which is why I had us think a little bit about what makes us afraid. I think this is the good news that Micah's vision offers us today, this hope that someday we will not be afraid. In the New Testament, in the letter of 1 John, there's this powerful image. 1 John 4:18 says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love." So there's a connection between love and the absence of fear. And our own experiences of love may be more complex. We know that love can be complicated. It can involve fear and anxiety and stress and all of those things. But the love of God, the writer of 1 John tells us, is able to overcome our fear. And this is a message we've heard many times, right? The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness did not overcome it. So in this last part, I want to reflect a little bit about the relationship of fear to violence. So what is fear? I'm not an expert, but when I did some research, fear is a response to harm or the threat of harm. And harm can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be psychological, it can be spiritual or intellectual. And our human response when we encounter direct harm or the threat of harm is to become afraid. Now, let's remind ourselves that fear is not just negative. It does have an important role in keeping us safe, right? It motivates us, it mobilizes us to cope with potential danger. So sometimes fear is that thing that keeps us safe. Some years ago, we had the active shooter training at Presby, and you might recall we watched a video, and the summary of that video was, if there is an active shooter situation, you are to run if you can, hide if you can't, and fight if you must. So run, hide, fight. Put another way, uh, flight, freeze, or fight. Those are kind of our instinctive, animal reptilian brain responses to fear. We either freeze, or we run, or we fight when we have to. So what this implies, if this analysis has any validity, is that fear happens as a response to harm or threat. There is something that triggers fear. Fear doesn't just appear for no reason. And so just thinking about the last year, right, there was a lot of threat from the virus, right? There was fear of going out of your house, fear of breathing the air that other people around you were breathing, because so many of us were afraid of getting sick before the vaccines, before we knew as much as we know now, which is still not so much more that we want to know. So a lot of us have experienced this fear due to the threat of the virus. But also, we saw last summer, after the murder of George Floyd, there was just a tremendous escalation of anger and of sorrow and fear responding to kind of this perceived, just rising of the temperature in our society. I'm sure a lot of us, either whether because we went out and marched or we saw it on the news, we felt ourselves getting anxious. And in a recent study that was published, I think this week, gun buyership went up sharply in the pandemic. And a lot of the first-time buyers were women and minorities who, again, it's speculation, but were not feeling safe in their homes, who wanted to have something to defend their homes against the perceived threat of racism, of prejudice, of violence out on the street. So I think we can resonate well with this connection between harm, threat, and fear, because all of us, most of us, have experienced it this year. Well, that response to fear, the development from fear, is the arming or the weaponizing. Literally, whether it's buying a gun, or verbal, in the ways that we weaponize our language when we demonize others and discount them as inhuman, right? We treat other people as if they were animals and not fellow human beings created in the same image that we are. And whether we've done it, we've probably been tempted to do it if we haven't done it or said it. So we've seen this dynamic as well, right? A response to fear being to arm ourselves, to defend ourselves, to disparage, to depreciate others. And that often spills over into the actual harm of war and conflict. Whether it is the use of a gun to settle a dispute that should not have required violence. On a nationwide level, right? If a nation perceives a threat and is afraid and builds up its arsenal, it makes it more likely, more risky that armed conflict can break out. And that starts the whole circle or spiral again, because war itself is the presence of harm, the threat of further violence. And so fear can continue to spiral unchecked and out of control. So what is the counterpoint to this dynamic of harm and threat causing reaction of fear, leading to weaponization, leading to war and conflict? Well, I'm going to start with fear again, and I believe that the counterpoint of fear is faith or trust, right? What is the absence of fear but the ability to trust and to have confidence? And trust or faith is possible when harm and threat are removed. And so, as I thought about this, I think that it is the presence of justice and mercy that communicates to people that they are not in danger. So let me say a little more about this, because this may not be self-evident. Um, I believe that justice and mercy are the same as safety and prosperity. When we think back to the 8th century prophets, like Amos, like Isaiah, like Hosea, like Micah, they all preached against the sins of idolatry, that is, worshiping things that were not God. But they also sharply convicted Israel and Judah of the sin of injustice. They said, if you do not address this, you are going to die as a nation. So I would venture to say that injustice, which in these books is always condemned in economic and material terms, right? Injustice is not abstract. It is false balances in the marketplace. It is underpaying your employees or being underpaid. It is taking advantage of others for your own material gain. That's injustice. Inequitable distribution of resources. So injustice itself is a form of idolatry, because it is when we consider ourselves better than others. We look out just for our own interests. And that's why when we look at the life of Martin Luther King, his activism for justice was always economic. It was material. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott that began his public career in December of 1955, to the solidarity with the sanitation worker strike in Memphis, where he was assassinated in 1968. He knew, and we have to realize that when people's needs are met, when they receive fair wages and are treated with dignity and compassion, the primary sources of harm and threat are addressed, and there isn't a vacuum of despair to be filled with harm and threat and things that nourish extremist convictions. In a way, I believe it's that simple. If we take care of bodily needs, that would take care of a lot of the problems that we see in our society. I think that faith that proceeds from the experience of justice and mercy leads, instead of the posture of suspicion and closure to perceived threats to ourselves or our communities, leads to a posture of openness, of being able to learn from and receive from others. Justice and mercy makes possible a state that helps us to lay down our weapons and instead to learn, to see the beauty of those around us as God has created. And so the end result is peace instead of war. Instead of destruction, we have the possibility of construction. We have the possibility of transformation, the possibility of cooperation. I think that's good news. But we are stuck in the middle. On the one hand, we only need to listen to the daily news to know that war is very much a part of our world and does not look like it's going away anytime soon. But on the other hand, we haven't given up. We haven't given up. That's why we try, right? Diplomacy. Um, we are wanting peace because we know there is a better way. Maybe we just haven't found the will as a society to choose it. And this is a dynamic of what I call already and not yet. Simultaneously, something has happened and we're not yet where we want to be. I think the positive example of this comes from Jesus' own preaching. When he appears for the first time, he says here in Mark 1:15, the time is fulfilled, the time has been made perfect, and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. That is, during Jesus' earthly ministry, he kept telling us that the kingdom is here, it is among you, it has arrived. but it is not yet made complete. That is left for us to do with God's help. And so on this Memorial Day weekend, as we look to the past and we mourn victims of violence, as we look to the future to a vision of Mount Zion and the transformation of the landscape, we are encouraged in our worship together to keep working for peace. We talk about things that are obsolete, things that are no longer useful or needed. How can we make war and conflict obsolete? Well, we can't. God has to change enough of us to turn the tide of history to value others' lives over our own, to not turn away from the suffering of others. And that is the meaning of the cross. The cross and the resurrection shows us that giving up your life is the way to true life. To take our swords and spears and to do the hard work, to transform them into life-saving and life-giving tools, is one way that we lay down our lives and follow the way of Jesus of Nazareth. And while it does not mean that we will have no reason to be afraid in this life, we can walk further, we can follow Jesus further and experience more of the fear that God does commend, right? The reverence, the fear of the Lord, that is the beginning of wisdom. So in conclusion, I want to show you a brief video, which I think illustrates Micah's vision in a very specific, concrete way.
There's folks that say, you know, this is not a gun problem, it's a heart problem. And what we're saying is it's both.
Just yesterday, there was another double murder in North Philadelphia. 2 people that were killed. A reminder that there are 90 lives a day at stake right now, over 30,000 a year, and this is not okay.
What would it look like to address the triggers in our hearts and the triggers in our streets?
So the prophets in the Bible have this vision they give, this image of God's people beating their swords into plows, their spears into pruning hooks, turning the instruments that have brought death into instruments that can bring life, this beautiful transformation. And it ends by saying that people will study violence no more.
We're excited to share the visuals of mothers who have lost their kids to gun violence, beating on the barrel of a gun, and those of us who are there to witness it, get to watch this healing and kind of this trauma leave their body.
And that's exactly what we're talking about in this book, both the spirituality of violence and also the real epidemic of gun violence in this country.
Will you pray with me? God, give us hope in the midst of grief and anxiety. Help us to seek to follow you in the way of peace. Help us to know the life that is found in laying our lives down. Thank you. We pray in your name. Amen.